Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part 5 of this Mari for Beginners series, and today we're going to be going through the node graph. So I'm inside of Mari here and I'm going to make a new project. I'm going to leave everything as default, but under channels you can see that we've got some selected, just the default ones. Not going to do anything with these, they're just a great way to demonstrate how it makes nodes and what nodes are to begin with, and then we'll start making our own ones. Great, so I'm going to hit create new project. If you've watched the series so far, then we've already gone through things like the paint buffer, the UI, and other really important parts. So I'm going to assume that you've watched those and breeze through that. It's knowledge that you need to know. And so I'm not going to go over it again. Go and watch those if you haven't already. So I've got this project here and I've turned on an environment light. I've got my node graph open here and I've got my node properties on the right. And I've just pulled that out. That's my general workflow, is to have that there just so I can easily access it as I'm going along. And what we can see inside the node graph here is we've got some nodes that it's made for me by default when I enabled those channels. Before we get into that, however, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through my preferences here. So I don't know what the default is anymore, but I've changed the control type to nuke because I'm really familiar with that program. And I've changed the default port display to horizontal rather than vertical. If you've used nuke, you might be more familiar with the vertical layout. I really don't like that. However, I think it's really annoying to work with. So I always work with horizontal. And basically that means we read the node tree that we make from left to right rather than top to bottom. And it also shows the ports in a little bit of a better way, I personally think. We've got some other options here that we're not going to touch, but just be aware that there are preferences for the node graph inside of here. Great. So let's have a quick zoom in and see what we've got here. And so we've got a lot of nodes. We've got one here called the bottom transparency. We've got a paint node here. We've got this thing called base, but it's blue. We've got this one called a base color. We've got one called specular, one called roughness, and one called bump. And these are the channels that I told it to create when I was creating this project. And we can tell that because if I go up to the channel palette here, we've got one called base, one called bump, one called roughness, and one called specular, which are these right here. After that, we've got this principal BRDF, which is a shader. And we can tell that because if I go to the shaders palette, we've got principal BRDF here. And after that, we've got the viewer, and this is really similar to the viewer inside of Nuke. So we've got our shader showing in the node graph, and we've also got our channels showing in the node graph. Well, what's this base thing? Well, if I head over to layers, and I deselect that, now I'm going to select this base thing that it shows here, and it's selecting this node here, which is actually a merge node, but more on that later. So the reason I'm showing you this, we're not actually going to play with the layers palette because I think layers are really pale in comparison versus the node graph, and this demonstrates it perfectly because I'm not only seeing my layer, but I'm also seeing all of my channels, all of the other layers inside of those channels, and my shader that all of these channels are plugged into. And it's just a really powerful way of consolidating loads of information in one simple space. Especially when you get quite complex scenes inside the node graph. While it might look like you're looking at a complete spaghetti junction of nodes, understanding it and decrypting it in the node graph versus having to go through all your channels and all your layers is just so much easier, and it's so much more powerful as well because you can start sharing data. But again, more on that later. So to begin with, let's look at some shortcuts. Because I'm using the nuke preferences for getting around, then I only am going to go through those, but I can middle mouse click to pan around, or I can use the scroll wheel on my mouse to zoom in. I can also hold Alt and left click to pan, or Alt and middle mouse to zoom in and out. If I've got loads of nodes kind of placed all around, I can hit L on the keyboard and that will auto place them for me. And if you're using older versions of Mari, I think I'm in 4.6 or something here, previous versions used to not lay them out quite as nicely, but now they've sort of upped that algorithm and it's much better. So we've got these default nodes here. Well, what are they? How do I see what these actually are? Well, to view a node, what you need to do is press 1, 2, 3, any number on your keyboard, and that will view that node. So I'm going to select this node, then hit 1, and you can see this arrow has just been created, and it's going into my viewer now. And it's thinking about it, and you can see that this node is just pure grey. This paint node here is pure grey. If I hit 2 on this bottom transparency, it's going to think about it for a second. Mari can be quite slow switching nodes, I should say that. You can see that this bottom transparency is, as it suggests, a transparent node, and the reason it's checkerboard is because there's no information here, it's just completely transparent. And now that these two nodes, which I selected and then pressed 1 and 2 on the keyboard, are in my viewer, what I can do is unselect, hit 1 and 2 to jump between these nodes. I can jump back up and forwards. And say, for example, I wanted to view this shader now, I can hit 3 on that. And now it's going to show me it all nice and shaded, and I can press 3 at any time to jump back to there, or 1 to jump back to this paint node, and so on and so forth. So this is great and all, Michael, but let's start making nodes. Okay, let's get on with it. So I'm going to delete these nodes here, and I'm just going to leave this base color channel open. If you don't understand channels, don't worry, we're going to go over them in full detail in the next video, which is going to be channels and basic color space. So I'm not going to go into them too much, but the way to think about it is just it's a collection of data. That's all it is. And this collection of data is being put into my base color of my shader. So anything that goes in here is going to go into the color of my shader. So let's get some color in there. So to create a node, you can either right click and go down to nodes, and this is every single node that Mari offers. So for example, I know the color node is under basic. We can go color, or if I want to do something like a Perlin, then I can go to noise, and we've got Perlin noise there, or I've got fractals. I've got other things like, for example, filters. I can use HSVs or contrasts or anything like that. They're all under here. But if you've been using Mari for a long time, like I have, or you just know the node that you're looking for, then it can sometimes be quicker to press tab and just search for it. So the tab brings up the search bar, and I can just go color there, and that shows me everything with COL in it. And I can just use the keyboards to scroll through them, and I can either click one or press enter, and that's going to make it. So I've created this color node here, and if I hit 1 on it, you're going to see that it is white. Not loving that color, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to change it. I want to make it something a little bit more marbly, like it's some sort of marble statue. So I'm going to change it to yellow, and I'm going to bring down the color a little bit, so it's not quite as bright. I'm going to hit OK on that. So now to connect a node, what I can do is I can pull off from the output and put that into the input here, and this arrow will then connect up. So now if I view this shader, we'll see that color affecting my mesh. Great. Well, this is great and all, but it's looking a little bit plain. So let's get another color in there. So I could make another color node, drop this down. I'm going to use a darker one to begin with. So let's get something kind of dark, sort of dark brown. Hit OK on that. But this base color will only take a single input. And I can't put it in there. And if I put that into the input, it's just going to overwrite what's already in there. So what I can do, if I undo that, to join two nodes together or join anything together inside the node graph, what you need to do is use a merge node. So if I hit tab again, I can type in merge node, and that will make one. Or because you're going to be using these quite a lot, they're super important nodes, I can press M on my keyboard, and that's going to make one. So we can see here, this is the same as this base node here. So these base nodes are merge nodes. Mari just renamed them when it created them to begin with, but this is a merge node. So what's a merge node? If you're familiar with NukaTool, you'll understand this, but if you are coming from something like Photoshop or Substance, which uses layers, then this isn't something you've ever really had to think about. And a merge node basically takes two things and combines them. So we've got our inputs here on the left, and we've got our outputs on the right-hand side, and that's the same with every single node. Some nodes don't have inputs, like this color node doesn't have any inputs, but this merge node does. So we've got three inputs. We've got base, we've got over, and we've got mask. So what this merge node does basically is it has one thing as the base color, and it has a second thing that's going to merge over it. And you can also use a mask, which is a black and white image, to tell it where you want it to merge. So to begin with, let's connect these two things up. So I can either pull off the arrows here, or what I can do is I can snap this node into the node tree that already exists by hovering it over this arrow. And when it goes yellow, if I release, then it's going to jump it in there. And that's really useful if you're connecting a lot of nodes, you're going to be using that all the time. So I'm viewing the shader still, and nothing's happened. That's because this is just telling it what the base is. And now I'm going to put this second color, this darker brown, into the over, and we'll see what happens. And you can see now I'm viewing this color because it's merging it on top of the base, and this base is completely disappeared because we're not seeing it anymore. And I can demonstrate that this is what is happening by double clicking on this merge node, and we're bringing up the node properties here. We're going to talk more about this and these things later, but we've got this thing called amount, which is basically opacity, the amount that this is merging on top. So at the moment we've got 1, which is 100%. If I were to take this down to 0, then you can see that we're viewing our first color, this lighter color only, and I can set it to 0.5, and that will give me 50% of each. So I'm going to take this back up to 1, and let's start talking about masks now. So a mask is a black and white image or texture or whatever you want to use that will tell this merge node where to merge things and where to not merge things. So I mentioned a Perlin earlier, and what I'm going to use is a Perlin noise as a mask to quickly get something in there. So I'm going to type in Perlin, that's going to bring it up. And if I view this now by pressing 1 on my keyboard and double clicking this to see the node properties, we'll see what's going on with this purlin. So purlin noise is just a procedural sort of noise. And if I change this size, you'll start seeing that we've kind of got this soft sort of transition from black to white spots. And it really is quite a simple shape. Inside of the node properties, I can change the white and black. Say, for example, I wanted this white to actually be red. So now it's red spots to black spots. But because we're using a mask, then I want this to be white. And now if I plug this into my mask of my merge node and view this, we'll see that anywhere that's white is going to be merging 100%, and anywhere that is black is going to be merging 0%. So in some places I've got my base color, and in some places I've got my over color, and we can demonstrate this by, I'm just going to change this base color, and we'll see that in some places it's now magenta, or whatever I had. I'm going to cancel that. But yeah, that's a quick demonstration of working with masks. This is great and all, but it doesn't look particularly realistic. What if I wanted this darker color to actually be like grunge or grime dripping down this statue? Well, we can paint something rather than using a procedural mask. So let's talk about another really important node that you're going to be using a lot, which is a paint node. So I'm going to delete this purlin now. I'm going to press P on my keyboard, or I can type in paint, and that will bring up a paint node. And when I make a paint node, it's going to bring up this UI where I can choose the settings of it before I pop it down. So we can change the size of every single paint node. We can change the bit depth of it, so 8-bit, 32-bit, or 16-bit. I'm going to keep it 16-bit for now. We can change this. I'm going to leave this as it is. I never really touched that. And we can also change the color. The color of a node can be really important because this is just going to be what it floods it with by default. So I want it to be black, and then I'm just going to paint in white details to reveal my darker color. And at the moment, I set this earlier to an alpha of 0, and that just means that my paint node will be flooded with no transparency. So I'm just going to set this back up to 1. And so now you can see it's gone from transparent to completely opaque. And if I hit OK on that, that's going to do that. Color space, again, is going to be talked about in the next video, so I don't want to go into this too much, but because I'm painting a mask, which is scalar data, which is data that you're not going to see basically on your mesh, it's non-color data, then I am just going to turn this to scalar, and I'm going to turn it to raw. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but just because it's a mask, I am going to do this now. In the next video, we're going to go through this properly. So I'm going to hit OK on that, and I'm going to view it. You'll see that it's just a black node, completely filled. And I'm going to plug this into my mask. So now that we've got this mask selected, I can combine some of the other stuff that we've done in other videos, the previous ones, and start combining this all sort of together. So I'm going to use the paint through projection tool, and I'm going to use an image that I've brought into my image manager here, a grunge texture from textures.com. I'm just going to drag that into my perspective view here, which will enable the paint through tool. If you don't know what I'm doing here, then do go back and watch that video because I've already gone through all this. And now if I just select my mesh to make sure that's all working, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to view this through the shader. So as I paint, I can view the results. Basically, anywhere that's white is going to reveal this darker color. Anywhere that's black is going to keep it with this lighter base color. And so with my paint node, making sure that's selected there so I know I'm painting into it, I can start painting some details onto my mesh. So paint nodes are the only way that you can get a hand-painted detail into your node graph, so you're going to be using them probably quite a lot, and you can combine them with other more procedural things to get really cool workflows going on. So paint nodes are something that I would recommend getting familiar with because you are going to need them a lot. If you want to do projections, if you want to do hand painting, you need a paint node. Some drips under the nose, maybe he's got a cold. Hopefully it's not the Rona. So very quickly you can see that by using a single mask and 2 color nodes, which is a very, very simple setup, I've got quite a lot of detail there because I'm using a really cool texture that I found online. So this is great and all, but actually, you know what? Now that I'm looking at it, I think this lighter color that I'm using underneath is really basic, and I probably want to get a bit more texture detail in there. So how would I go about doing that? What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out slightly on my node graph, and I'm going to pull this color off here, which is my lighter color here, and I'm going to merge something on top of this. So I'm going to hit merge here, and I'm going to drop this in just so it snaps in. This is now my base color, and I'm going to make a new paint node because I want to paint something in this time. So I'm going to press P, and I'm going to set this to 8-bit because I'm going to be using an image from the web, and I'm going to turn off scalar data and raw because this time I'm going to be painting with color data. Again, more on that next time. And I'm going to change this color. I'm going to make it transparent so that there's nothing in this node. Because I'm not using a mask this time, then that's quite important to do. So I'm going to hit OK on this, hit OK on this. Now I've got this new paint node. And I'm going to merge this over now here. Nothing's going to change because this is a transparent paint node. I can see that by pressing 1 on my keyboard. We can see there's no data in here. But I'm going to drag off this cool texture I found on textures.com again, and I'm going to start painting into this paint node here. Just get a little bit of detail in some places. Just like this. It's hardly going to be a masterpiece. I just want to get something on there. Maybe clean up some of the stretching ever so slightly. And now if I view this merge node, where this is going to be merging on top of my lighter yellow color, you can see how that's come on top. Great. And then if I view this merge node after that, because we're reading from left to right, then that's going to be merged on top. And so finally, if I view that through my shader with my light and shadow, you can see how that's looking. So that's great, but actually, you know what? It's going to take a while to paint all this marble texture by hand. What if I just wanted to place this texture down really, really quickly? Well, there's a great node called the tiled node. So I'm going to drop that in. And instead of this paint node, I'm actually going to use that. So if I double click on this node here, you can see that it's looking for an image to input here. So I'm just going to drag and drop this into here. And now what it's doing is it's applying this texture across all of my UVs, across my entire mesh. And that is now sitting on there quite nicely. If I don't like the scale on this or other things, then I can play with some of the node properties in this node. So the UV repeat, for example, if I set that to 3, it's going to be 3 times as small, and it's going to repeat this image 3 times across every single UDIM. I can also change, for example, I've got rotation if I wanted to rotate that. Whatever I want to do, that's all inside the node properties. So very quickly, you can see how I've used just a couple of nodes to start building up some detail in this texture, and by no means is it great, but this is just a demonstration of how nodes work, and I can start merging in, layering on more things, and start actually building up these textures properly if this were a real asset, not just for a tutorial. Hello, Editor Mike here, and there's one thing I forgot to mention with the paint node, and that's really important. So if you want to import textures from an external program, say for example Substance or anything like that, you want to import some textures that you're not going to just be using to project through, but you want to lay onto your UVs like bakes or anything like that, then you can do that with a paint node, and all you need to do is right click a paint node and go to File, Import, and it'll bring up this little import UI. And I know, for example, I've got some bakes here for this Squirtle model, and I can select them here. So I've got my AO, I've got my curvature, and you can see it's picking up the UDIMs here because I'm using this little wildcard here, and you can hover over that to see the other wildcards that you can use, but I'm using the UDIM ones. If for some reason your images don't appear and you're in the right folder, sometimes Mari can be a little bit funny with this template, so just delete that and you should see everything inside of that folder. So I'm just going to import my AO now, I'm going to select that and I'm going to import all patches. This isn't going to be right because these bakes don't line up with this mesh, but we're just going to do it, and I'm going to ignore color space for now. We're not talking about that again in the next video. So I'm going to import all patches. It's going to think about it. And now if I hit 1 on that, we'll see that it has brought something in. Obviously it's not correct because those bakes don't line up with this mesh, but that's how you import external texture data into Mari. Paint node, right click it, File, Import, and it will import into that paint node. Great, let's carry on. So let's say, for example, this was done. One great thing about the node graph is you can start sharing things across to other channels at other parts of your node graph. So I'm going to move this across here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move this along, and I've got my roughness here. We're just going to move this so that my roughness is showing with these nodes it created for me by default. But let's say, for example, I wanted to use some of these details for my roughness. Because I've already painted this, if I were using layers, then I would have to use like layer linking and all that stuff, and it's really, really, really arduous to work with. But inside of the node graph, if I wanted to use this as my roughness has to be black and white. I can just set down an HSV or a saturation or anything that plays with the saturation, drag this in here. I'm going to hit 1 to view this now. Change the saturation down on that, and now I've got a black and white image that I can then just plug into my roughness really, really quickly. It's absolutely not going to look correct, but you can just see now we've got difference in roughness values in different parts of my mesh. Very quickly I've made a roughness map there, and because I know that to make a really cheap roughness I just have to desat my base color and invert it, this should look a little bit better. So I've just used an invert node there, I've plonked that down. And very quickly with 2 nodes, I've got a roughness map working for me. And that's using all of this data here earlier. So if I were to change this tile texture or I were to change this mask, this is all running along. And then at this point, it's going to split off and it's going to take all those updates without me having to do a single thing and apply that into my roughness. This is why I really like the node graph, because you can start sharing things. I could take this, for example, I could take this paint mask that I've made and I can drag this off and I can start putting it into other merge nodes if I wanted to use it somewhere else. That is the power of the node graph, is being able to share things really quickly. It's a lot cleaner to work with. It's a lot faster to work with. Nodes, they're bloody great. So I'm inside of a finished project here, and this is this Squirtle that I've been working on. If you've been watching any of the Twitch streams or anything like that, you might be familiar with it. If not, there is going to be a full tutorial series coming out on Gumroad soon for this, and I'm going to put some stuff up on the YouTube channel as well. But so this is a finished project, and I just want to show how complex node graphs can get. So this might look really, really daunting to begin with, but I've used some tips I'm going to go through in a second to help sort of alleviate any of the confusion. I've got some backdrops here to help name things. If I zoom in as well, then I've named all my nodes correctly. So I know, for example, this is a back shell color node. I know this is the color for the white edge on the shell. Yeah, it's super, super important to do that. So yeah, while there's a lot going on, it's really easy to kind of understand what's happening. Whereas if I were to view this within layers, had I started within layers, there's no way to see it as easily. Granted, I'm a very visual person, but if you were making this in layers, it would be such a bloody nightmare to sort out and going back through and trying to make changes. But also you can see here, so for example, this is a mask node down here. This I can use, I've got it here in 3 different places. Quite simply, I'm just pulling it off and using it in loads of places. And this node here, I'm using that. You can see how many times that's coming off. And this is the mask for the beak. That's just coming off into all these different nodes because I need it in all these other places. If I were trying to do that with like layer linking and mask stacks inside of the layer, oh God, it's giving me a migraine just thinking about it. So I'm back in this other project now, and let's just talk about a little bit about housekeeping. And it's super boring, I'm sorry, but it's really, really important to keep an eye on. You just saw the complexity of that scene. Knowing where a node is, knowing where things are is so important when you start getting quite complex scenes. So say, for example, this node, it's called paint to begin with, but this is my mask for my grime. So I'm just going to view this shader again, and I'm going to double click on this here. And where it says paint here, I can just change this now to grime mask. And now if I were to right click and go to edit search, say I knew there was a mask called grime, then I can just type in grime mask and that's going to show it for me. And if I hit enter, it's going to take me to that node. I can also press J on the keyboard. That's why naming nodes is really important. But also it just means I can see this and I know exactly what this node does, whereas color 1 doesn't really tell me anything. So this is actually grime color. So I should change this to grime color. Another tip is this thing called a backdrop node. And this is a little bit different to normal nodes. And all this basically is, it's like a little thing. It's like a little group that anything inside of here gets grouped together, and now when I click this backdrop it all moves together. But the best thing about it is when I zoom out, if I have loads of nodes, the name of this backdrop nodes shows from afar. So say for example this was all my masks, then if I were to zoom out, then I can see very quickly where my masks are and I can zoom in on that. Obviously it's not my mask, so I'm just going to change that name. I can also change the color if I really wanted to, so I can start color coding things. One final little tip is if I hold control on my keyboard, it's going to bring up this diamond in the middle of arrows. And what that's going to do is it's going to make this thing called a dot. And basically, similar to Nuke, you can just say, for example, you've got a node all the way over here and you just want to control how these arrows look. If you want to make it a little bit tidier, then you can just start creating dots to do that. And that way, instead of getting these unwieldy sort of spaghetti junctions all the way across your node graph, you can use dots to just clean it up a little bit like that. Don't have to, but I think it can be quite useful. So I'm inside of another project here, and this is my Gumroad camera series that I made previously inside of Mari and Substance, and this is the Mari version of it, obviously. And so you can see I've got a lot less nodes than the Squirtle going on here, but there's still quite a lot going on, a lot of spaghetti junctions, and I've used some backdrop nodes and stuff like that to help sort of identify things. But when you start getting a lot of nodes, it can be quite slow to view things. So you can do this thing called a bake point node. And so if I drop down one of these, it's going to ask me how I want it to be. So I know, for example, this is 4K. I'm going to leave it like that. Bit depth 8 is fine. I'm going to leave all of this as it is, and I'm just going to hit OK. And what this bake point does is basically it compiles everything before it in the node tree into a single image, and it just kind of bakes it and caches it so that your scene can work a little bit quicker. So if I double click this bake point now, I've got all my settings here, which I can change on the fly. If, for example, I want to make the bake point a little bit lower res, but for now I'm just going to hit bake, and it's going to compile it. We can see down here it's baking the shader, and now that's done, it's gone green. And so now to view this, it's going to be a lot quicker because it's compiled potentially hundreds of nodes upstream into a single baked texture. And you can use these in multiple points in your scene, and they're just a great way to help speed up your progress as you're going. If everything before it is kind of signed off and finished and you're happy with it, then what you can do is bake that and start making changes after it. So you can see now, if I just set a color node into this, so I'm viewing this bake point, and if I just input a pure white color node, it doesn't change. It's gone red because it knows something before it has changed. So if I were to rebake that now, you can see now this bake point is just pure white because I've rebaked what was going into it. So we've talked about quite a few different types of nodes. We've talked about color nodes, we've talked about some of the filters, we've talked about some of the procedurals, and there are a lot in here, and I do just recommend going through and seeing what you can do with a lot of these, especially the procedural nodes. We've got some really cool fractals, we've got some really cool patterns that you can use. Wood and oil especially are two that I don't use enough, but they're just really, really cool. As I touched on earlier in the video, and we're going to talk about more in the next video, you can see your channels inside the node graph, which also means that you can make channels inside the node graph. So I press tab there and I can make a new channel by doing that. And similar to making a new paint node, it's going to pop up and it's going to ask me for all the settings that I want this channel to have. So I can change the size, I can change the bit depth, I can change how it deals with color space in the mask and also color data. Again, more on that in the next video, so I'm not going to touch on that too heavily. I just want you to know that you don't really have to use the channel palette. I don't ever use it anymore because of the node graph. I can also make shaders. I've got the principled BRDF here, but say I wanted to make an Unreal shader, then I can make that. I always use the one with Shader Network because it has more options. There's also an Arnold shader, so Shader Network version of that. I can use those, so I don't have to use the principled BRDF in my scene if I don't want to. That said, I usually just use the principled BRDF because it's quite user-friendly. So there are literally probably hundreds of nodes inside of here, and I'm not going to go through all of them because this video is probably already long enough, but there's a couple that I want to talk about to round off this video. So first of all, let's talk about the Ambient Occlusion node, which can be found under Geometry, Ambient Occlusion. If I were to pop this down and view this, you're not going to see anything on your mesh, and that's because you have to calculate ambient occlusion first of all. So to do that, all I need to do is go up to Objects and then go to Ambient Occlusion. It's just going to calculate it on my mesh, and now I'm going to get AO on my mesh. It's nowhere near as good as like substances or anything like that, but it's really useful to have sometimes. And what I can do now is I can just, a tip that I like to do is I will just merge that on top. So I'm going to hit M for merge node. So if I view this now with the normal blend mode, it's just going to show me this AO because it's merging over. But if I change this blend mode to darken and multiply, then what it's going to do is it's going to ignore all the white values as multiply usually does. If you don't know about that, blend modes are used in loads of pieces of software like Photoshop and stuff like that, and it basically just changes the math of the merge node. But multiply just ignores the white values and burns in the darker values. So this AO is now being burnt in a little bit. So here's a little tip with the node graph. I often burn in a little bit of the AO just with a multiply, because when you're viewing a node just with 1 or 2 as the keyboard shortcut, it shows you it flat. But if you add a little bit of ambient occlusion on top, then it just shows you a little bit of the curvature of the mesh, and you can just paint a little bit easier. So that's a really handy tip if you're finding it's quite difficult to paint in the node graph because it's flat. So either use shaded view or use an AO multiplied on top. Last thing I'm going to talk about is materials very quickly. I don't really like Mari materials. I've spoken about this at length before. They're fine. I just don't think they're any more powerful than hand setting stuff up. I know a lot of people will adamantly disagree with that. I have made a separate video on materials, so you can go and view that if you want a bit more information on them. I'm just going to touch on them briefly now because they are very intrinsically linked into the node graph. So to make a material, all you need to do is type in material, and that's going to bring it up. I'm going to select principled BRDF because that's the shader that I'm working with, and I am just going to create a shader network for this example and hit OK. That's going to connect it to a shader for me, and we can see that I'm now viewing this material. There's not really much going on there because I haven't actually gone in and created one yet, but to demonstrate this, I'm just going to bring one off the shelf. So I'm going to go to Mari Materials and just drop this in. And now if I plug that in, it's going to show this. And this is the brick material. If I double click the node, it will show me some pre-exposed parameters from inside the material that can change. And I can change the rotation and the scale and whatnot. So that's all good, but let's say I wanted to merge two materials together. You can't just use a normal merge node like we were doing before. So I'm going to press tab and search for the merge node, and you can see we've got this one called a multi-channel merge node there as well. And I'm going to select the same shader model, make sure it's the right one, and this is the way to merge two materials together. So I'm going to put one in the base, one in the over, and I'm just going to use a purlin again and just change the scale on that very quickly. And you'll see if I put that into the shader, then we can view that. You can't view a material all at once unless it's through a shader. So I'm viewing that through the shader, and you can see now that these two things, I've got gold in some places, I've got bricks in others. And you can very quickly, you can start building up stuff like that. Personally, it's not my favorite thing, so I don't hugely use them. If you want some more information, there'll be a link in the video description for that, for the material video that I've already kind of covered, which talks about making your own materials, setting stuff up, setting up all these kind of exposed parameters, all that jazz. I've already done it. So we're not going to talk about that because I don't think it's something you need to know Mari for beginners. So yeah, my voice has gone very hoarse from recording this. I think this was like the 7th take, but I think we're finally there. So this video is hopefully over, and join me in the next one when I finally get online, which is going to be going over channels and basic color space. We're going to go through all the different channels, making channels, color versus scalar data for kind of basic color space stuff, exporting textures, and also a bit of shaders. Great. So yeah, I'm going to have some more tutorials coming up on YouTube soon. Hopefully the Squirtle series is going to be rounded up soon as well. I also am streaming once or twice a week on Twitch, so if you haven't seen one of those streams yet, head on over there to check that out and join the Discord because I usually announce those 2 days in advance. Great. I've been Michael Wilde. I really hope you got something out of this. If you've got any questions, leave them below or on the Discord. Take it easy, guys, and best of luck whatever you're doing in 3D. Cool. Cheers.